Paul Levy was born on December 3rd, 1889 in Wandsbek, a town located in Prussia, now known as modern-day Hamburg, Germany. 10 years after his birth, his father would pack up Paul and his 5 siblings and would move the family to New York City. Paul had a love of the arts and attended the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. While he may have adopted the stage name Paul Bern, he soon realized that he was better suited for a life behind the camera. He started out his career as a stage manager on Broadway while living with his common-law wife, Dorthy, who he had met while both were acting students at the Academy. Paul loved Dorothy deeply, which was enough for the two of them. They didn't feel like they needed to get married. Dorothy was known as Mrs. Paul Bern regardless. Most of their friends thought that they were married. But Paul's mother, Henriette, did not approve of the relationship. She had told Paul that if he didn't break it off with Dorothy, she would end her life. And when she found out that the unwed couple had been living together, well, she followed through on that threat. After Paul's mother took her own life, Dorothy had a complete mental breakdown. Paul checked her into the best sanatorium he could afford. Even when money was scarce, he found a way to pay the bills and ensured that Dorothy was always well cared for. And with Dorothy safely tucked away, Paul headed west for the bright lights of Hollywood. Now, Harleen Carpenter was born 3 years after Paul's family had arrived in New York on March 3rd, 1911 in Kansas City. Her mother, Jean, called her baby. She packed her young daughter up and took her to Hollywood in search of her own fame. She enrolled Baby at the Hollywood School for Girls while she searched for roles of her own. The pair were unable to find work, though, and money ran out. They eventually returned to Kansas. Harleen ended up marrying Chuck McGrew in 1928. Chuck was set to inherit quite the fortune upon his 21st birthday, which so happened to take place 2 months after their nuptials. Apparently, her time in Hollywood hadn't been enough, and so Harleen took Chuck and his fortune to Beverly Hills, where she took on her first role as a young society wife. And it was that role that would lead to her next. While dropping off a friend at the Fox lot, she was spotted and offered movie work. She resisted at first, but her mother insisted that the baby take the role. And so she did, registering at Central Casting under the name Jean Harlow. Jean took her first unbilled role in 1928, much to Chuck's dismay. He didn't want his wife working. He wanted her by his side. But Jean liked the work and the paycheck that came with it. By the end of the year, Jean and Chuck were over, but her movie career had just begun. She would land her first major role opposite Clara Bow in The Saturday Night Kid, but it was the transition to the talkies that would really launch her into stardom. Howard Hughes had just spent the last 2 years working on Hell's Angels and was in need of someone to replace Greta Nielsen and her thick Scandinavian accent. Jean was perfect for the reshoots. Because Howard was not so much into the movie-making side of things, his contract with Jean allowed her to work for other studios like Columbia and Warner Brothers. Oh, and MGM, where Paul just happened to be a producer. It was Paul Bern who got Jean the role in the 1932 film The Beast of the City. She was a huge hit. The fans loved her, and MGM loved the attention. In April of that year, they negotiated purchase of Jean's contract from Howard. She was officially on the MGM roster. Now, Jean didn't intend to fall for Paul. He wasn't the best-looking guy on the block, but he offered her something most men did not: respect. Jean was used to being admired for her looks, but Paul appreciated her intelligence. He talked to her. "He's different," she had said. "He explains things. He lets me know I have a brain." The pair were married on July 2nd, 1932 at Jean's home on Clubview Drive. While their wedding was small, it featured the Hollywood elite like Irving Thalberg, production head at MGM, and his wife, Norma Shearer, who was also famous in her own right. They had a private reception the following day at Paul's estate in Benedict Canyon. Jean's second marriage ensured her continued success in Hollywood. Paul had negotiated her part in Red-Headed Woman, which paid her $1,250 a week. That would be almost 30,000 doll hairs today. Imagine. And while she loved how kind and respectful he was toward her, the two were very different in their approach to life. Paul loved his storybook home nestled in the quiet hills of Benedict Canyon. He had been in Hollywood longer than Jean had, and he appreciated the peace. But Jean loved the glitz and the glitter of the bustling young movie town at the height of its golden age. She would have much rather been in her home on Clubview Drive, the one that was now unfortunately inhabited by her mother and her lech of a stepfather. But while Paul was building his dream career in his dream house and marrying his dream young wife, Dorothy was still back in New York, where she had spent the last 10 years in the sanatorium. When she finally got out, she moved into the Algonquin Hotel, where she wrote to Paul, hoping to see him. He had stopped visiting her long ago. She missed him. Would he come see her? But Paul had a new life with a young new bride. He would write back to Dorothy that he was just too busy. The timing wasn't right. But if he couldn't come to her, she would go to him. Paul told her no, she should wait. He simply didn't have time to see her. But Dorothy didn't listen. On September 4th, just 2 months after she said, "I do," Jean was set to visit her mother for dinner. Paul didn't know if he'd be able to come, so Jean popped her head into his bedroom and bid him good night just in case he couldn't make it to dinner. Jean had an overnight bag with her, intending upon spending the night at her mother's house so that she could make her early call time in the morning. When she got to Clubview Drive, she called Paul to check in and see if he would be able to make it. He was apparently indisposed and wouldn't be coming over. Jean offered to return home. "No," Paul said hastily. "You stay there." The following morning on September 5th, Paul's butler, John Carmichael, went to check on Paul after not hearing from him all morning. John checked Paul's bedroom only to find it empty. But then he went into the dressing room, which is where he found his employer slumped over the floor in the closet, nude. He had a revolver in his right hand, blood coated the walls and clothing. Paul was only 42. John passed out at the sight. The gardener, Clifton E. Davis, would find John passed out next to Paul in the dressing room. MGM was called immediately. The police, they wouldn't be called until 3 hours later. When they arrived, they found a note written to Jean. "Dearest dear, unfortunately, this is the only way to make good the frightful wrong I have done to you and to wipe out my abject humiliation. I love you. Paul. P.S. You understand that last night was only a comedy." What's really strange is that when John arrived in the room, there had been no note on the dresser. Instead, another loaded revolver sat in its place. Police questioned John and his wife, Winifred, Paul's maid. They had confirmed that they had heard what they thought was a quarrel between Jean and Paul the night before, but Winifred did note that the woman's voice had not sounded like Jean's. They had then heard a loud bang and the door slam. When Winifred looked outside, she saw a black-veiled woman running out to a chauffeured car. In her haste, the woman had lost her shoe, a black kitten heel. But that wasn't the only thing that was left behind. No, by the pool sat 2 empty glasses and a yellow bathing suit that was not Jean's size. A neighbor had confirmed Winifred's story, stating that she had also seen a woman dash into a limousine around 3 a.m. that morning. It was Irving Thalberg who broke the news to Jean that morning. His wife, Norma, had picked him up from Paul's home to drive him to tell Jean. She had collapsed in his arms, repeating, "I don't understand. I don't understand what you mean." Police were just as confused as Jean. The scene of Paul's alleged life-taking didn't make sense to them either, nor did the fact that it took so long for them to be called to the scene. They wanted answers, and so did Paul's family, who didn't believe that he would take his own life. Paul's friends and neighbors also didn't believe that a man who was so sensitive to those around him would ever leave his body to be found by the people that he employed and cared about. The police tried to question Jean, who told them that she hadn't fought with her husband the night before, nor did she have any idea what Paul had been referring to in his note. The studio then cut off access to Jean and put out a statement claiming that they didn't believe an inquest was needed. They were satisfied that Paul had taken his own life, there was no mystery, and that there was nothing further that needed to be investigated. The coroner, however, disagreed and went forward with the inquest. Jean was excused from testifying by her doctor based on the fact that she was comatose with hysteria, which translates loosely to Louis B. Mayer forbid it. Still, the inquest didn't really answer any questions, with the verdict reading, death by wound to the head, self-inflicted by the deceased with life-taking intent. Motive undetermined. Now, Dorothy Millette had been living at the Plaza Hotel in San Francisco for 4 months under the name Mrs. Paul Bern when she heard the announcement of Paul's death over the radio. After paying up her account at the hotel, she booked a $3 stateroom on the Delta King River boat, which she boarded on September 6th. At 2:30 a.m., a man saw Dorothy on the top deck crying. 2 hours later, 2 night watchmen found a woman's coat and shoes on the deck. When Dorothy did not disembark in Sacramento, they started searching for her. Back in San Francisco, police found a bag belonging to Dorothy that contained letters from Paul and from his secretary who had arranged funds for her trip to the city. Not only that, but it was discovered that Paul had been supporting Dorothy and even had left her money in an earlier will that referred to her as my wife, Dorothy. While Paul's brother had said that Dorothy was brought into the family as his wife, but that they had never married, others believed that Paul had secretly married Dorothy. Was Paul a bigamist? The gossip made MGM scramble to cover up anything that may harm Jean's career. The abject humiliation from the note, according to Louis B. Mayer, Paul could not fulfill his marital obligations to his young wife. They had further help in crafting their preferred narrative with inside fixers Howard Strickling and Whitey Hendry. Not only that, but guess which DA was in charge of investigating Paul's death? Our old friend Bern Fitz, who was in his 2nd term as district attorney. It's alleged that he was bribed by MGM to accept Paul's death as self-inflicted. Whitey later admitted to a close friend that he had indeed arranged Paul's crime scene to look like he had done it himself. Dorothy's body was found days later by fishermen in the Sacramento River. Among items in her stateroom were movie magazines, with one in particular open to an article titled, "The Life of Beautiful Jean Harlow." Dorothy died penniless, and yet she was laid to rest in an upscale cemetery in Sacramento. Her gravestone simply reads, Dorothy Millette Bern, 1886 to 1932. Jean, anonymously, paid for her burial. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you liked this one. If you did, please save it and share it with your friends. It really does help spread the good word of the cult. And don't forget to follow me on the gram, the two of the U, just in case, especially if you're below the 49th parallel. Good day, and may the cult be with you.